All right, we're recording in 3, 2, and 1.
So Ralph Baer invented everything we enjoy about the 80s back in the 60s. The problem was no one could get along with him.
Who the fuck is Ralph Baer? Welcome to episode 145 of Nerdery Murdery.
Big 145. This is Zig with your nerdery.
And I'm Geoffrey with your Murdery. Welcome to another week. The highs and lows, the ups and downs, the good and the bad, the nerd and the murd. I meant to tell you last week when we were talking, you were talking about your daughter going to take up golf. One thing I want to recommend highly,
Mm-hmm.
try to tell her not to get frustrated.
Okay.
It's a very hard game. And it's so easy to get very frustrated because she's going to ground her club a lot. She's gonna hit a worm burner. She's going to shank it. She's going to be all over the place. I mean, my God, I played yesterday. We had these high winds, and I shot a nice straight drive, and then the wind grabbed it and just threw it left all the way over to another hole,
Oh no.
or threw it right. Excuse me. So it can be very frustrating, and especially as a new player. Lessons help a lot because there are people out there. Um, uh, there are people out there that will give really good lessons, and I highly recommend it. So anyway, I meant to mention that last week.
Okay.
Um,
It's her and my father-in-law's deal.
okay,
So
yeah,
I'm gonna let them do their thing.
go out and play with them. You'll
Yeah.
enjoy it. You'll enjoy it. Just don't get frustrated.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
very easy to get frustrated.
What is a worm burner?
When you hit it low on the ground and it just goes straight and low and rolls a bunch instead of getting it in the air. Called a
Oh,
worm
okay, that
burner.
makes sense.
Yeah, those are real easy to get. It's really easy to top the ball. When you top it, you get worm burners a lot. Sometimes if you get it too high in the air when it's windy, it's going to go all kinds of different directions. It's very hard to hit it straight because you got to keep your club face closed, and there's so much intricacies with it. It's just I have fun with it. It's very 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 difficult. I tried to play in a tournament last weekend, and the club pro sent me a message, and he said, your handicap's too high to be in the tournament. He said, I don't want you to get disappointed or frustrated, so we'll work on it. So, we'll see. But anyway,
Nice.
have you watched Fargo, the TV series?
Yes.
Have you seen season 5?
Which one is season 5?
Season 5 is the one with John Hamm as
No, I haven't
as
seen
the
season
sheriff.
5.
Dude, okay. So I've seen several websites, and most websites agree with me. Season 2, I would say season 1 and season 2 are 1B and 1A. Season 2 is just slightly better than 1, but I think 1 is great.
Mhm.
3, although it's good, I felt it was a very slow burn, the one with Ewan McGregor.
Okay.
4, I didn't like as much. I thought it was
That's
the
4 was the one with Chris Rock.
yes.
Okay. See, I
Uh,
watched that one. I thought it was really good. I
it
like that
is
whole.
it is really good, but it's also a slow burn, and I just didn't feel that it fit real well with the Fargo storylines because they're all connected. Season 5 is phenomenal. Um, it'd be hard for me to say whether it was as good as 1 and 2 or just slightly before, but or slightly less better. But season 5, and I mean from the very first episode, one of the things I love about TV shows like this is in the very first episode, I left it at the end of it with like, what the fuck is going on? You know, um, it's it's so great, and I mean, and I couldn't stop watching the 5th season. So great. I recommend it highly. Another show I was going to bring up that I didn't know if you've watched is Burn.
Burn.
I think it's on Netflix,
Okay.
and it's a story that takes place inside of a convenience store. or basically a robbery inside of a convenience store, and this girl, the main character, who's just so terrifically weird. It's a very weird movie, but it's good. I think you would enjoy it.
It's a movie?
Yes.
Okay, I may check that out
Yeah.
today.
Yeah, give it a watch. Give it a watch. Um, but Burns, so give a watch for
Burn.
that. Yeah. So all right. With that, I don't have anything else unless you have anything. Let's get started on the nerdy side of the house.
Sweet. Today we're going to talk about the Magnavox Odyssey and the Magnavox Odyssey 2.
Okay.
The Magnavox Odyssey is the first commercial home video game console. The hardware was designed by a small team led by Ralph H. Baer at Sanders Associates, while Magnavox completed development and released in the United States in September of 1972. So this is before the Channel F.
Okay.
And overseas the following year. The Odyssey consists of a white, black, and brown box that connects to a television set and two rectangular controllers attached by wires. It is capable of displaying 3 square dots in one line of varying heights on the screen in a monochrome black and white with differing behaviors for the dots depending on the game played. Players place plastic overlays on the screen to display additional visual elements for each game, and one of the two players for each game controls their dot with the knob and buttons on the controller by the rules given for the game. The console cannot generate audio or track scores. The Odyssey console came packaged with dice, paper money, and other board game paraphernalia to accompany the games. While a peripheral controller, the first video game light gun, was sold separately. In 1951, while working for a military contractor, Laurel Electronics, engineer Ralph H. Baer was assigned to build a television set. Baer later claimed that while doing so, he had the idea to build something into a television set that the owner could control in addition to its normal function of receiving signals with a remote television station. Laurel did not purchase the idea, but it returned to Baer in August of 1966. While he was basically waiting for a bus. Baer, then the head of equipment design division at military contractor Sanders Associates, came up with the concept of using a television to play games. And the next morning wrote up a 4-page proposal for a game box that would plug into a television screen, costing around US $25 in 1966. The proposed device would transmit a signal that the television set could tune into, like a television channel, which Baer referred to as Channel LP, short for Let's Play. And he described several games that could be played on it. While electronics computer games had been developed since the start of the 1950s, they were typically only found in large academic or research institutions. And in 66, no commercial game or video game industry existed, or any form of video games for consumer television sets. So what he's talking about, the games that he's talking about that existed in research facilities and stuff, you had Tennis for Two, which you basically did on a $10,000 oscilloscope, and Space War, which you would program into an old mainframe system. As a game box, had little to do with the typical military contract Sanders worked on. Baer picked an empty room and assigned one of his technicians, Bob Tremblay, to work on it with him rather than bring the idea to his bosses. But by December of 66, they had completed an initial prototype, later christened TV Game Number 1, which could display and move a vertical line on a television screen. Baer demonstrated the prototype to the Sanders directors of research and development, Herbert Campman, who hesitantly agreed to fund it for $2,000 for labor and $500 for material, making it an official project. Again, this is $2,000 or $2,500 in 1966, so a fair amount of change. The Magnavox, so he gets it off the ground, gets it running, and he finally makes a deal with Magnavox. In August of 66, but along with Bill Harrison and Bill Rush, he created 7 successive prototype consoles. The 7th, known as a brown box, was shown to several manufacturers, but Magnavox agreed to produce it in January of 1971. And after releasing the console through their dealerships, Magnavox sold 69,000 units in its first calendar year and 350,000 by the time the console was discontinued in 1975. The console spawned the Odyssey series of dedicated consoles, as well as the 1978 Magnavox Odyssey 2. One of the 28 games made for the system, a ping pong game, was an inspiration for Atari's successful 1972 Pong arcade game, in turn driving sales of the Odyssey. Patents by Bayer and the other developers for the system and the games included what was termed as a judge by the pioneering patent of the video game art, formed the basis of several lawsuits spanning 20 years, earning Sanders and Magnavox over $100 million, largely from Atari. The release of the Odyssey marked the beginning of the first generation of video game consoles and was an early part of the rise of the video game industry. The original Odyssey had a number of removable circuit cards, switched between the built-in games. With the Odyssey 2, each game could be a unique experience. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So the Magnavox Odyssey 100 dedicated consoles was announced in the spring of 1975, with first shipments on October 30th and a launch price of $99.95. Again, that's 1975 money. Although pricing dropped quickly, with prices listed by $80 by June of 76 and Christmas of 76 as low as $39.95. It used a multi-chip discrete component design, which makes it much simpler than all later dedicated consoles Magnavox would eventually release. Magnavox already had a single chip design in mind that year, but wanted to have a product they could release immediately if Texas Instruments, the supplier of their single video game chips, was unable to deliver in a timely manner. So the Odyssey 100, which is after the original Odyssey, were basically Pong clones. Which Atari then promptly sued Magnavox over. The thing is, all of this is closed up, but from the outside, it looks like Magnavox sued Atari, and then Atari sued Magnavox, and basically everything broke even. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. Essentially, everybody got their just desserts. And then the Odyssey 100 designs, they did like 5 of these things. I've included some videos and some pictures of them, but they're basically Pong clones. But at the same time, the idea for the VCS had already gotten out into the industry, as well as the Fairchild, which was released in 1976, as we know. Odyssey started working on a console system. So Magnavox Odyssey 2, which was stylized as Magnavox Odyssey to the power of 2, also known as the Philips Odyssey 2, is the second generation home video console that was released in 1978. Technically, it's third generation because Odyssey had already gone through 2 different iterations by then. Granted, the 100 consoles were basically all the same. Basically, if you bought the 100, the 200, the 300, the 400, it was all the same game. It was just a little cheaper, and they had some different designs on them. It was sold in Europe as the Philips Video Pack G700, in Brazil and Peru as the Philips Odyssey, and in Japan as Odyssey 2. The Odyssey 2 was one of the 5 major home consoles prior to the 1983 video game market crash, along with the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the Intellivision, and the ColecoVision. So in the early 70s, as we said, Magnavox did pioneer the home video game industry, but it was getting crushed. So they decided to come out with the Odyssey 2 in 1978. The original Odyssey, the Odyssey 2, each game could have a unique experience with its own background graphics, foreground graphics, gameplay, scoring, and music. The potential was enormous with an unlimited number of games that could be individually purchased. A game player could purchase a library of video games tailored to their own interests, unlike all other systems at the time. Well, except for the VCS and the Fairchild. The Odyssey 2 included a full alphanumeric membrane keyboard, which was to be used for educational games. selecting options or programming. Magnavox released a cartridge called Computer Intro with the intent of teaching simpler computer programming. There at the time there were 8 dedicated home video game consoles and 1 TV with a built-in game console. That was for the Odyssey series. The Odyssey 2 used a standard joystick design of the 70s and early 80s. The original console had a moderately sized silver controller held in one hand with a square housing for its 8-directional stick, which was manipulated by the other hand. Later releases had a similar black controller with an 8-pointed star-shaped housing for its 8-directional joystick. In the upper corner of the joystick was a single action button. And during the time of the Odyssey 2's manufacturing, some came with controllers that could be plugged and unplugged from the back of the unit via the DB9 connector, while others had their controllers hardwired into their rear. One of the strongest points of the system was its speech synthesis unit, which was released as an add-on for speech, music, and sound effects. The area that the Odyssey 2 may be best remembered was its pioneering fusion of board and video games. The Master Strategy series, the first game released, was Quest for the Rings, with gameplay somewhat similar to Dungeons & Dragons and a storyline reminiscent of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Later, 2 other games were released in this series, Conquest of the World and The Great Wall Street Fortune Hunt, each with its own game board. Its graphics and few color choices compared to its biggest competitor at the time, the Atari 2600, Mattel's Intellivision, and the Bally Astrocade were its weaker points. The Odyssey 2 was listed by Jeff Rovin as being the third in a total of sales and one of the 7 major video game suppliers. Now, in our YouTube playlist, I have included some of these board games that they're talking about. It's essentially you use the video game system and the board game for 2 players to basically play Dark Tower. It's a lot like Dark Tower in that it's there's some randomization. It is slightly better than Atari's Dungeons and Dragons game, which was called Adventure.
Well, no, there was a Dungeons and Dragons game, but Adventure was their big castle one where you go through that.
Yeah,
And you
the first foray one.
Yeah.
Kids, get out and check out those board game plays. That thing is fascinating. It looks like a combination of a console game, a computer game, and a D&D game at the same time. It was really innovative, and the artwork was beautiful. It was really cool. It's one of those things, I think, if Odyssey had another iteration, they may have been a bigger player in the game market, but like everything else, they kind of got out of the business after the 83 crash. And then, the Japanese companies came in and cleaned everybody's clocks. About 1984, 1985. But yeah, the Odyssey 2 was an amazing system. But even down to the cartridge design, which had little handles on them, so they were easier to pull in and pull out. I thought it was a brilliant design. Our local used video game store has one in a box on a shelf. They actually got it fired up and figured out how to get it running. The Odyssey 2, one of the problems with it is it did require some input on that membrane keyboard to get the games to run. So it was a little more complex. Again, being designed by Ralph H. Baer, who also designed the Teddy Ruxpin, although the Teddy Ruxpin we eventually got was nothing like what he designed. He designed several other things that ended up becoming mainstream technology in the 1980s, but his designs were always way more complex. It's like he was designing things for engineers, not for children. Speak and spell, things like that. He did a lot of stuff like that. And he is fondly remembered as one of the pioneers of the electronics game in general, not just video games, but even handheld electronic games. But yeah, the idea for the Odyssey 2 with some of those board games is just, they're fascinating. And if you can get out there and get them, Odyssey 2 stuff is still relatively cheap to get, because it is so difficult to turn it on and use. But once you figure it out, it's pretty cool. I knew one kid that had one. Um, so I have seen that board game play. I was actually watching two other kids play because it was only a two-player game. Um, but it was fascinating, and it's something that we should talk about. And as we're getting into the nostalgic games are becoming a big thing now. This is one of those ones that should be in the conversation because it was a beautiful design. You could see the pictures in the website and some of the videos we've talked about. It was a beautiful design. It was well thought out. The implementation of it was kind of difficult, but again, you're coming from an engineer to children, so it was kind of hard to set up and run. But it does work. Even some of the old ones, they don't have leaky um, capacitors like a lot of the other games of the time do, because you come up with a leaky capacitor and you fire it up and you hear a pop and it stops working. Um, you don't really have to crack it open and get into the boards because of the way it was designed. Um, One of the problems would be with the membrane keyboard. Those are notoriously hard to work, but a lot of them that are out there are still in fairly good working order. But yeah, I think you guys should get out and check out the Odyssey, especially some of the videos we've included. Some good games. Do you ever play Odyssey or Odyssey 2?
No, I remember it, but I never knew anybody that had it. I mean, I had an Atari 2600,
Me too.
2600, and that was my main game system until I got my Commodore 64. But I don't think I knew anybody that had an Odyssey.
I knew like one. Well, actually, it was like a friend of a friend, and we happened to be over there and was watching them play this basically Dungeons and Dragons game
Hmm.
for God, probably hours. But it was fascinating. It looked like it was a lot of fun.
Oh, and Atari didn't have Dungeons and Dragons. It was in television that had
Yep,
that.
television that had it. Oh, speaking of television, we were talking about the Amico. God, what is this, like a year and a half ago?
Hmm.
Yeah, the Amico's never going to see the light of day. Um, all those Kickstarters got their clocks cleaned.
Mm.
So unfortunately, even though we have videos out there of people playing it, it's never going to get released.
Mm. Mm.
Uh, it's sad, but I wish it would happen. Whereas Atari is releasing stuff every day now. There's something new from Atari coming out all the time, including 7800 um, consoles, and which will play the 2600 consoles or games, as well as like an update of the 5200. And they're also about to release an Atari 400 computer mini system,
Mm.
just like the Commodores. So that'll be fun to see. Oh, and it's beautiful too. But yeah, the Odyssey 2 was basically that first computer and game console released, like Atari tried to do with the 400s and the 800s. But, by that time we were all into Commodores. So it didn't really capture the market. But yeah, it's one of those things that you should really look at. It's a beautiful design, if nothing else. And I think the next console slash computer we're going to talk about will probably be the ColecoVision and the Atom, which was plagued with problems.
Hmm.
But the ColecoVision console itself was beautiful. It worked really, really well, and you could play 2,600 games on it if you got the add-on. But yeah, that's about it for the Odyssey.
Cool. Thanks for another trip down memory lane with another video game system. Appreciate that.
Sure, sure.
With that, we'll step over to the murdery side of the house.
Murder.
For today, I got my information off Medium, CBS News, The Cinemaholic, Murderpedia, and ABC 9 WMR News. And this is the murder of Kimberly Cates.
Kimberly Cates.
So, when pediatric nurse Kimberly Cates and her husband David relocated to the picturesque New England town of Mount Vernon, New Hampshire in 2003, the safety conscious couple wasted no time in having an alarm system installed. They did have a young daughter to think about, so they weren't taking any chances. And after a year or so of peaceful living without fear of crime entering their lives, they relaxed and allowed themselves to believe that nothing bad ever happened in the little slice of heaven they now called home. Foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
In the early mornings of October 4th, 2009, while David was away on business, the threat of violence the Cates family had thought they had left behind in the big city found its way into their sanctuary with devastating results. At around 3 o'clock a.m., Kimberly had been awakened by a dim light shining in her face. Thinking that her daughter needed her, she sat up and asked Jamie, "Is that you?" But her query was met with a series of savage blows from a machete, 36 in all. She,
Wow.
she was stabbed numerous times in the neck and torso by a second assailant. And alerted by her mother's screams, 11-year-old Jamie, who had been sound asleep in bed in the same bed, bolted upright and attempted to run. Her progress was halted by a knife-wielding intruder who proceeded to stab her 18 times in the chest, arms, legs, and back. At one point, she had fallen into her attacker's arms, prompting him to throw her across the room into a glass door. And assuming that,
Good God.
I know, pretty savage. And assuming that both victims were dead, the killer spent the next few minutes looking for valuables. And after pilfering several items of jewelry, they fled into the night. When she was certain the coast was clear, Jamie, who had lain perfectly still as the home invaders stepped over her lifeless body, crawled into the kitchen and called 911. After telling the dispatcher in a voice barely above a whisper that someone had killed her mother, she collapsed on the floor. And at around 4 o'clock that morning, first responders arrived on the scene. The officer who found Jamie recalled that she had been covered in blood. Part of her left foot was missing, and she had suffered numerous injuries, including a fractured jaw, and a deep laceration across her throat. However, despite her condition, she was conscious and remarkably lucid. And in the bedroom upstairs, paramedics discovered Kimberly's brutalized body. And upon confirming that she had not survived the violent attack, a call was placed to the county coroner. An autopsy would show that the 3 dozen blows Kimberly sustained had all but destroyed much of her body. Among other things, her skull had been nearly split in half, and it was clear that whomever was behind the killing had acted without restraint, hacking away at the helpless woman in her own bed. The official determination held that, though the injuries had done irreparable damage, none had been lethal. Rather, Kimberly had bled to death.
Oh.
It is surmised that she had likely been awake and aware of what was happening to her throughout much of the attack.
Oh my God.
As investigators were combing over the crime scene across town, 17-year-old Stephen Spader and his buddy, 19-year-old Christopher Gribble, showed up at the home of their mutual friend, Autumn Savoy, shortly before sunrise. After excitedly telling them that they had just killed 2 people, they asked for his help in getting rid of the evidence. And not the least bit surprised by the admission, since he had been asked in advance to participate but had wisely declined, Savoy agreed to lend a hand. At 5:30 a.m., the trio gathered up the bloody clothing that had been worn during the killings, along with the stolen goods they decided that weren't worth selling, and threw them in the Nassau River. So this was all for nothing. Nothing.
Real kill.
They believed they were free and clear, so Spader and Gribble then retreated to their respective houses to catch up on a few hours of sleep. Once waking, Gribble headed to the pawn shop, and what they didn't unload was Kimberly's gold jewelry. The entire lot they got came to a sum of $130,000 or $130.
$130.
Later that afternoon, the pair had a visit to the home of another friend, Kyle Fenton, and they bragged loudly to Kyle about the double homicide they had pulled off without a hitch, but they were unaware that their buddy's mother could hear every word. Knowing what she had to do, though, she did the good thing and she called the police.
Of course she did.
As it turned out, Spader and Gribble had been making the rounds, boasting to their friends and acquaintances of the killings throughout the morning. And instead of being impressed, several of the stunned listeners had reported the admission to authorities. Before the day was through, both Spader and Gribble were in custody. In addition to the 2 main players, their accomplices, William Marks, 18, and Quinn Glover, 17, were also picked up in for questioning. After being read his rights, Gribble was asked about his involvement in the murders, an interview that he was informed was being recorded. He seemed unbothered by the situation, and the suspect assured detectives that his knowledge of the crime was limited to what he had seen on the 6 o'clock news. Gribble, who was cool as a cucumber throughout the hours-long interrogation, described himself as a gentleman whose chivalrousness would never allow him to harm a female. He went on to claim that he was appalled at the notion that anyone would inflict such violence upon anyone, especially an 11-year-old child. When he was informed that Jamie had survived and would be able to identify her assailant, he acted as if he were thrilled with the news. And even after learning he was being implicated by his cohorts, Gribble refused to budge. He was determined to walk away scot-free, and he wasn't about to put a noose around his neck if there was any way around it. So after repeatedly proclaiming his innocence, Gribble shut down the interview, and following the letter of the law, detectives had turned off the tape recorder and left the room. Gribble then, who made no attempt to leave, remained in the interrogation room. And a while later, Gribble summoned one of the detectives with whom he had established a rapport back into the room, and seemingly out of curiosity, he had asked if the Cates killing would warrant the death penalty. The detectives couldn't say for certain, but he indicated that the state of New Hampshire had stringent requirements for such an extreme sentence, and he didn't believe the case would fall under that umbrella. I could.
Anything a cop tells you in an interrogation room
Yeah. Oh.
is don't believe them. Their job is to get a confession.
Well,
The
yeah.
only thing you should say when you're in an interrogation room is, "Where is my lawyer?"
Right. Right. Gribble then inquired about the possible prison terms that would be handed down if killers were found guilty.
This
And
guy
after
does not seem like the sharpest knife in the drawer to begin.
agreed. After pondering his options, he told the detective to turn the tape recorder back on as he was ready to reveal what he knew. And before proceeding, the investigators had made a point of having Gribble repeat his request to speak on record, and he was also informed that his right to remain silent still applied. After affirming that he was acting of his own free will, he gave a detailed account of the events that had taken place less than 24 hours earlier. According to Gribble, his best friend Stephen Spader had masterminded the murders. In the days leading up to the actual crime, Spader and William Marks scouted locations searching for a secluded property with no neighbors close enough to hear the screams. They had found exactly what they were looking for at 4 Trowel Road, which was the Cates residence, and Gribble insisted that none of them knew who lived in the house and didn't care. Their plan was to kill everyone and steal anything they thought they could sell for profit. Upon arriving at the house under cover of darkness, the group, which consisted of Gribble, Spader, Marks, and Glover, found the place locked up tight. But Marks was small of stature, and so it was decided he would sneak in through a narrow basement window and let the others in by way of upstairs door. He was successful of entering the house, but once inside, he discovered he couldn't get out of the basement, so they moved to Plan B, and the others removed an air conditioner and climbed in through the gaping space that it had occupied. They then unlocked the basement door, allowing Marks to join them, and at that point, they'd been on the property for about a half hour. They then disabled the lights via a breaker box, and then they went from room to room using the lights from their cell phones as a guide, and it was in the master bedroom where they found what they were looking for. As Spader and Gribble unleashed a frenzied attack on the mother and daughter, Marks watched from the doorway, just taking in the carnage. Glover, however, was unable to stomach the grisly scene, and he had retreated to the living room until it was over. Throughout his confession, Gribble had maintained an emotionless monotone, with his voice not betraying a single shred of regret or remorse. He had spoken of the gurgling sounds that came from Kimberly that had prompted him to stab her in the throat in the same manner as one would describe writing out a grocery list. He also lamented the fact that he hadn't made sure that Jamie was dead, and he asserted that this wasn't because of his innate cruelty, but rather because he felt it would have spared her the pain of going through life without a mother. As Gribble was telling his version of events, Stephen Spader was across the hall doing the same. While he too had started out protesting his innocence, after learning that his buddies were telling a much different story, he dropped the who me routine pretty quickly. It was said that he was not one bit ashamed of his actions, and he had told his story with a sense of accomplishment that only those who kill with ease are capable of understanding. When describing the events the previous night, Spader recounted how the little girl had screamed and struggled with Gribble while he hacked up the mom. As it turned out, Spader had been a ticking time bomb since the moment he sprung from the womb of his drug-addled mother. Although he was adopted when he was 5 days old by a loving family who had given him the world and more, he was a bad seed, and no amount of tough love or coddling was going to change who he was at the core. His adoptive mother recalled he had been a model child until he reached middle school, when seemingly overnight he turned into a monster she no longer recognized as her son. He was defiant, belligerent, at times violent, and her child turned into her worst nightmare. Hoping to save him from himself, his parents had pulled him out of public school and enrolled him in a private institution. Determined to choose his own path, Spader, who was now heavily involved in the local drug scene, dropped out. His parents weren't quite ready to give up on their son, and they sent him to a therapist. And this gesture, although it was well intended, did nothing to alter his downward spiral, because even as he kept his family at arm's length, Spader was forming his own support system via a group of social outcasts who were in desperate need of a leader. Against all odds, they found what they were looking for in the former school bully who bragged openly of his desire to kill total strangers for the thrill of watching them die. This band of miscreants, whom Spader dubbed the Disciples of Destruction, consisted of Gribble, Marks, and Glover, with the founder as the supreme leader. And followers that they were, the trio of misfits vowed that they would do as they were instructed, or be forever ostracized from the group. As part of their initiation into the group, the teenagers had to agree to participate in a home invasion. And not only would they be expected to rob and pillage, but also kill all the occupants, whether they be men, women, or children. Shockingly, none of them had batted an eye at the prospect of taking an innocent life on Spader's orders, and given their mutual admiration of mass murderers and serial killers, who they viewed as folk heroes to be emulated, perhaps their willingness to take the lives of others really wasn't so surprising at all. While Gribble had been hesitant to admit guilt, at least initially, Spader shared no such qualms. Seeing the writing on the wall, he readily confessed to his role in the murder of Kimberly Cates and the attempted murder of her daughter Jamie. And rather than showing remorse, he had been upset. With himself for making the mistake of choosing accomplices whose incompetence at leaving behind a living witness had led to their capture. While the suspects were being interviewed, a search was performed on Gribble's car, and inside the vehicles, the deputies found an axe, a box of trash bags, a shovel, gloves, rope, camouflage clothing, and a pawn shop receipt dated for earlier that morning. At the conclusion of the interrogation, Spader was remanded to custody and charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit burglary, and witness tampering. His fellow inmates at the county jail would later tell authorities that Spader had boasted about the attack that decimated the Cates family. Whether his captive audience wanted to hear it or not, he would relive the night of the murder over and over again, making sure to emphasize the number of blows he had administered with the machete, along with his victims' agonized responses. At the trial, Glover and Savoy testified against Spader in exchange for lighter sentences. On the stand, Glover told the jury that the defendant would often share his fantasies about breaking into a home and slaughtering the occupants. And not only had he wanted to kill them in the most gruesome of fashions, but had allegedly wanted to cook and feast upon their remains if time allowed. This allegation reaffirmed prosecutor Geoffrey Strelzin's characterization of Spader as a psychopath. Glover, who had fled to the living room and covered his ears to muffle the victim's screams, had been the only one to recoil from the violence that was perpetrated upon the helpless mother and child. Although he was a fan of horror movies, had an interest in serial killers, the reality was far worse than he had imagined.
Yeah. I love horror movies, and we're interested in serial killers. We don't go out and kill people.
Mm-mm. No.
It's a weird equivalency. Okay, I'm sorry. Please continue.
Oh, you're fine. With that said, though, he had gone along, and even after Spader had informed his disciples on the way to the Cates residence that they were about to be party to the evilest thing this town had ever seen. In November of 2010, Spader was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The trial judge, not holding back, told him outright that he belonged in a cage. 2 years later, following changes in the law that negated life without parole for those who had committed offenses as minors, Spader became eligible for a reduced sentence. When this subject was broached, Spader balked. Happy where he was, he refused to cooperate with the appeal process. He informed his attorneys that he was, quote, the most sick and twisted person you'll ever meet, and he washed his hands of the proceedings. Moving ahead without him, his legal team applied for the reduction, and in the end, Spader received a sentence of life plus 26 years. In 2013, he orders his attorneys to drop all appeals, and today he is imprisoned in New Jersey, where he will remain for the duration of his natural life. Glover pleaded guilty to burglary, robbery, and conspiracy to commit burglary, and was sentenced to 20 to 40 years behind bar. His earliest possible release date will be 2029. William Marks, who observed the vicious attacks on Kimberly and Jamie from the doorway, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit both murder and burglary. For his role, he was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. Marks's father, who stood by his son through thick and thin, expressed regret for the home invasion and subsequent murder. But even so, he couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if William had faced harsher penalties from his previous run-ins with the law. He was a malcontent who had spurned his parents' attempts to put him on the right path through therapy, and the 18-year-old had a dark side that no amount of intervention seemed to keep at bay. In a poem penned by Marks, he had ominously shared his twisted desires by stating, "I always keep an axe at my side, looking for my next homicide." So maybe he'll get help while he spends years in custody of the state.
Yep.
Autumn Savoy, who had aided in the cover-up, was ordered to serve 5 to 12 years for hindering apprehension and conspiracy. He was paroled in 2012, and as far as anyone knows, he has stayed out of trouble since. Christopher Gribble, although he wasn't the ringleader, is an even more terrifying specimen than Spader, if such a thing is possible. When he faced a judge in March of 2011, he exuded both arrogance and evil from every pore. He was a devout Mormon who had planned to become a missionary before going another way entirely. He admitted that he had been consumed with thoughts of murder since childhood. The target of his murderous fantasies in those early years was the person he was closest to in the world, his mother. Gribble's built-up hostility towards his mother stemmed from her methods of discipline, which he found to be extreme. According to him, he endured spankings that he believed went too far. And as a teenager, he had considered it a form of corporal punishment when his mom would insist on popping the acne on his back. And he also complained about such mundane things of having been forced to vacuum the house at a very young age. And I mean, some people might see performing household chores as character building. He viewed it as yet another degrading punishment dished out by the woman he'd grown to despise. In a voice completely devoid of emotion, Gribble related how he wanted to, quote, cut pieces off her and listen to her scream. He also wondered what it would be like to throw her into a vat of boiling water or smother her in sugar and tie her down to a hill of fire ants. Much like the other parents of Spader's crew, Gribble's family had taken him to see a psychiatrist, but nothing helping there. The so-called expert in her field had brushed it off when her patient confided he had felt that he had the potential to become a serial rapist. That's one of the things. When a psychiatrist hears you may commit a crime, they are required to report that.
Yes. Yes.
So he did also tell her of his deep-seated hatred of his parents, especially his mother. He let his therapist know in no uncertain terms that he would like to see them dead. Although the psychiatrist had shared this information with the Gribble, she assured them he was merely blowing off steam. She likened his outburst to an angry child threatening to kill someone in a fit of temper, and in her opinion, he wasn't a danger to himself or others. And with that, Christopher Gribble was given the green light to act on his disturbing thoughts. He was a loner who had trouble making friends, and he first met Spader in Boy Scouts, and after losing touch, the pair reconnected in 2009, and a symbiotic relationship was formed. Gribble was a follower in need of guidance, and Spader, who was a natural leader who wanted control over others, were a perfect storm of sinister energy waiting to be unleashed upon the world.
Narcissistic sociopath and a what do they call that? Their henchmen, flying monkeys.
Yes, yeah.
I'm
Well,
sorry. Please go ahead.
no, you're fine. Well, Gribble made no secret of the fact that he knew before entering the Cates home that everyone inside was going to die. When the time came for him to spring into action, he had stabbed both Jamie and her mother with calculated strokes, unlike his cohort, who had swung the machete with such wild abandon that his right hand man had feared becoming yet another casualty before all was said and done. As pompous a defendant as the court had ever seen, Gribble presented himself as a force to be reckoned with the very real possibility of spending decades in prison. He had smirked and replied that, quote, they, meaning the other inmates, have no idea who they're messing with. As it happened, Gribble would soon have to defend his words with actions. At the trial's end, he was found guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and conspiracy to commit burglary and witness tampering, and he was sentenced to life without parole. But the judge informed him that had it been within her power, she would have sentenced him to infinity. Gribble appealed his conviction, claiming he hadn't understood that he had the right to remain silent, even though he had been read his rights more than once and had verbally acknowledged that he understood their meaning. With life in prison looming, he painted himself as a poor soul who had been manipulated by overzealous members of law enforcement. No longer the wiseacre who saw himself as superior in every way, Gribble adopted the persona of a half-wit who didn't know the inner workings of the legal system. And even though he had been the one to initiate the confession, he took the position that he had been coerced by deputies. They had ample proof to the contrary, including his own voice captured on tape, agreeing that he was confessing of his own free will, and so the appeal was denied. Not nearly as savvy in real life as he was in the fantasy games that had consumed much of his time prior to the murder, Gribble soon had found out soon enough that thinking you're tough because you stabbed a woman and child as they slept and proving it to hardened criminals were two very different things.
Oh no.
Gribble was deemed weak-willed and fragile and quickly became the target of other inmates who, unlike him, could back up their bravado with actions. For his protection, he was placed in the penitentiary's special housing unit where he would spend the next several years before being integrated in the general population. And once there, he was summarily beaten up by another inmate, forcing officials to send him back to the SHU, where, reminiscent of his childhood, he remains isolated and coddled. Jamie and her father stayed in the home on Trial Road after the attack that left their family in shambles. For their protection.
Where was the father? Was the father away?
Yeah, he was away on business.
Okay.
For their protection, they purchased a guard dog and always utilized the alarm system. In the hopes of ensuring that Kimberly lived on the community, there was an annual golf tournament that was established in her name. The proceeds of the charity event, which takes place every year on the anniversary of her murder, go towards a scholarship fund set up for local students with their sights set on higher education. Jamie, who is now in her 20s, graduated from college and pursued a career in the healthcare field. She's a happy, very grounded young woman. She has long since moved past the events of the night when a chapter of her life was closed and another one opened. And while she will carry both the physical and emotional scars inflicted by the perpetrator's rest of her life, she refuses to let them define her, and she's a survivor, pure and simple. Kimberly Cates was, by all accounts, a ray of sunshine that was extinguished much too early. Outgoing, warm, loving, energetic, and kind, her death was felt throughout the community. She was a born caregiver without an enemy in the world, and she was a victim chosen at random by four malcontents who had no regard for the lives of others. Chillingly, Gribble had stated in the courtroom that should he ever be released, he couldn't guarantee that he would never kill again. Let's hope for society's sake that we never have to find out.
Yes.
And that's the story of the murder of Kimberly Cates.
Well, thank you for that, sir. That was fascinating.
Yeah, I found that one pretty wild, especially those four. They reminded me of Stephen Farrell, the Dracula kid.
Oh yeah, man, I felt so bad for those kids though.
Well, I mean, these kind of reminded me of that. I mean, they needed a leader, and they
Yeah.
it just kind of reminded me of those kids. So I don't know. Anyway, thanks for taking that journey with me.
Well, thank you, sir.
Appreciate it. That'll take us to the end of another recording week. As always, you can find everything that we talk about on our hub, nerderyandmurdery.com. That's where we have more information about what we talked about today, links to what we talked about, plus pictures. And you can also find the link to our YouTube page, which Zig so often updates.
Yes, there are videos for the Odyssey and some of the games, and you can see some of that stuff that we were talking about today.
Cool.
Nice and fresh.
Appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
You can also find the link to our merchandise page, where if you wish to show off your nerdery and murdery fandom, please do consider purchasing something from there. That, along with our Patreon, our patrons do help donate to the cost of the show. It does cost to keep us on the air, keeps our website updated, keeps our publishing going, and everything that's associated with that. It's not cheap, and it does not go to fund our luxurious vacations, cars, and homes.
It does not. Please and thank you.
Please and thank you. And last but not least, please don't forget to leave a 5-star review wherever you can. It really helps us and helps others find our content that may be looking for the topics we cover. And with that,
I have been Zig with your nerdery.
and I'm Geoffrey with your murdering.
Cue the music.